Well, good afternoon, and Stephanos, thank you so much for this very kind invitation and an opportunity to sort of put our pencils down in the Low Country and come up to South Bend. And I can say this afternoon, it was a joy walking through the studio. Steve has been a great host for the afternoon, talking with students over lunch. Just seeing these drawing boards, at work was uplifting for me. So thank you for having me. I'm humbled to be here and it's good to see so much good work being done. And so it challenges me to say, what could I really share with this audience? And what I've prepared to share, and I'm going to kind of move as fast or as slowly as we might want to, were things that I thought might be of some help for your students. And I think in a sense, and I'm finding more and more, I find myself talking about the humanist obligation of what we do as architects, and I'm obsessed with it really, and so I found I talk more generally about it to audiences, and so I will just say in advance that I hope my slides are not maybe too simple in some ways for this particular audience, but I really believe that architecture should be as accessible as possible and not a discipline that only architects know how to talk about. So that's been sort of my own arc in trying to practice and trying to share what it is that we do. And I think we resonate on so many themes that are important here at Notre Dame. This quote by Christopher Alexander is one that I come back to frequently, this idea that we cannot merely build a thing in isolation, but repair the world around it and within it so that the larger world at that one place becomes more coherent and more whole. And I think that idea of wholeness has really, as I've moved on, has resonated more and more in the particularly the idea of why we do this and who it's for and how we perceive it. And the human analogy is really the core of what I wanted to talk about this afternoon. That there should be a human analogy always in all work, and I think that unites all the many missions that we have. So my plan for tonight is to start with the big question, the why behind why we do this, perhaps ways of seeing that I'm still learning about, and then if there's time to talk about some of the work going from principle to practice. So the big question, of course, is why do we do this? And design as an act of beauty. I'm obsessed with this word beauty, that we have to use it often in public and out loud as much as we can. I was very pleased to see the banner, the war cry here at the School of Architecture, the restoring reason, beauty, and trust in architecture. I think that's wonderful. I might put beauty first, restoring beauty, because beauty is the thing. It's the irresistible thing. I think that's the secret. That's the secret to bringing people back to other big things like goodness and truth. So beauty. So yes, I absolutely want to talk about that as much as we can. Of course, we're often told we're not allowed to talk about it, but I think we have to. And then when we remind ourselves of, the Vitruvian pillars of architecture, which I know are well ingrained here, it reminds me how much, the modernist dictum of form follows function and function follows form. So we spent a lot of time arguing about which one came first, but completely missed the third leg of the Vitruvian triad. It doesn't really matter which comes first, form and function, if you don't have delight, which I think beauty is sort of a perfect way to sort of remind ourselves that that is that third pillar of architecture, maybe the most important one. I you know, over time studying Thomas Aquinas, I was intrigued, at his 3 pillars of good design, good architecture, integrity, clarity, and consonance, which I think seem fairly related to the Vitruvian, triad as well. And, so I think there's great truth here that we're working toward. I think it was Lou Kahn that said architecture is reaching out for the truth. So I think we're all on this journey. Of course, it changed dramatically during the Industrial Revolution. I love this postcard, this French postcard, imagining the world 100 years into the future. I think the prediction was by the year 2000, an architect would be sitting in this lovely booth pressing buttons while the machines carved the stone. Only thing it got wrong was the booths that the architects sit in today do not look quite this good, and we're not actually carving stone often, but cutting styrofoam. So it mostly came true, just not quite as elegantly as promised. And of course, every age uses its paradigm, and the idea of recasting cities as machines led to a great human loss in the 20th century. So this is really that affirmation that I think you all know very well, that cities are not machines. And this quote from Shakespeare, I believe, in The Merchant of Venice: "What is the city but the people? It is the irreducible act of placemaking. Buildings are people, and cities are people." So ways of seeing that, I think I've come to want to talk about that quite a bit more over time. This idea of how do we recover humanity in the work? And you really have to kind of go back to times when we were talking about it openly. The Renaissance operating system, you might say the Intel Inside logo of the Renaissance was the famous drawing by Leonardo da Vinci. The idea that we can start to create, a world around optical principles, and we could even understand the built environment. I think this is one of my very favorite drawings of all time by Francesco di Giorgio Martini, and I love showing this to people that think traditional architecture is some historical style that we don't use anymore. When you explain the dental molding, in fact, the reason these buildings seem so familiar to you is that you are seeing yourself in the building. I'm also so interested to see how the research in neuroscience today is revealing more and more that we are looking for people when we look at buildings. It's our first aesthetic processing. And Francesco's diagram of a complete city framed around the human body, this moment in time where there's this obsession around describing the world within the framework of our humanity. So I can talk a little bit about that, and being, a practitioner in Savannah, Georgia, I feel like I have to talk about it just a little bit. This is by no means a history lesson, certainly not to this audience. But the idea of planning a perfect city, which has such a rich heritage from the humanist era, but all these cities were almost too good to be true, too perfect to be human, but quite lovely. In fact, lovely enough, they were our Christmas card one year as we framed them as snowflakes. Of course, these ideas make their way into practical applications in the Baroque garden or in the Baroque city as order starts to be reimposed on the existing fabrics, or perhaps in London or in Paris. But the world that I practice in is in Savannah, Georgia, and so bringing that idea home to bringing this idea to the new world, you might say, was a chance for General James Oglethorpe to create a city that would have all of that enthusiastic impulse toward perfection that you might have found in one of the diagrams of the Italian humanist era, and he does it, right? So the organization of the Savannah Plan, the ward pattern that he created, in fact, succeeded, and it's succeeded over centuries. And I think many of you are familiar with this, but each and then the public lots that would face the public square, designed for civic and institutional uses. And that formula created an incredibly durable city over time, and in fact, it was expanded. The old family recipe, as one of our architectural historians at SCAD, Robin Williams, likes to say, is that, a family recipe can go on for generations, but you modify it just a bit each time, and if you look at the Savannah plan, you'll see that the wards on the east are actually a bit shorter than the wards in the middle, but they're using the same basic formula. So the city as it grew over time is in fact very diverse, but framed around this core idea of what's public and what's private. We were talking about that earlier with the students. So I look at the city and imagine it in concert with that diagram, the Francesco di Giorgio diagram. And I say this to say that a city in its entirety could have the clarity of a humanist diagram. And I think this is true in Savannah when we look at Bull Street as the spine of the city. As it had grown, it became sort of amorphous. It was almost too egalitarian. There are no terminated views. And there was a decisive decision in the 1850s the spine of the city, the central axis, Bull Street, and to in fact place a monument in every square along that particular axis, almost like acupuncture, reaching the vertebrae of a spine. And then above on the head of the body is our city hall, the gold dome of City Hall, kind of capping the body. And there it is. And so it's sort of we're reminded of this wherever you are in this particular city, that it zeroes out on that center line. I think they say in yoga, you're supposed to find your center, and I think there is something great about in it many hand gestures in Italian that we could talk about, but the one that I love is when something is really good, it's sort of perfect, you strike that center line down your body. Has anybody ever done that? I know a lot of you have been in Rome, but you do that, and just it's like if something's really good, you do the perfect symbol, but then you pull it down your center line, and it sort of sets you in the right frame of mind to understand something's really perfect. So, try it. So, in Savannah, that center line is the axis, it's where the addresses go to 0. You can literally stand in the middle of the street and feel your center, and so I can come back to this diagram from Francesco Di Giorgio and see I can see the city that way, and being in the city as sort of my center, it's very natural. So the church that's there at the heart of the body is very much aligned with one of our grandest churches in the city. The piazza, the stomach in the center of the city, the seat of governance and power, the gold dome of City Hall, the castle on the head where hopefully good decisions are dispensed. And then the arms and legs being the fortifications, the bastions, and the walls that surround the system and protect the body. And I think we can imagine the city as a collection of buildings or infrastructure or data sets, but we can also see it as a human enterprise. And I really believe that cities like Savannah have that gift to offer intuitively to anyone that spends time there. So all these words, that we use so often, but sort of forget what they mean. The idea that a building stands at address. This is a great diagram by David Macaulay reminding us that when a building faces a street, it is standing at address, very much the way I'm standing here tonight. The role of the skyline, the role of local symmetry around a skyline as we and again, in the world of neuroscience, we quickly are learning how much we process a crowd of people very intuitively, and we look for local symmetry around around the skyline, and we make quick judgments whether somebody looks friendly or, perhaps a little bit menacing. Of course, we could be totally wrong, but we do it automatically. So why would it be any different when we look at a beautiful lineup of buildings and ask ourselves, are these people that we would want to spend time with? This one actually looks really nice here. So so I think we have to start to remind ourselves that this is happening whether we like it or not. We are seeing the city as a lineup of people when we see a row of buildings at address. Of course, it's the same reason why so much of what we've built in the last century is completely unintelligible because it has none of the humanistic qualities. It's a world that's been mechanized and virtualized at the same time. Certainly with the automobile, but also even with the idea that we don't know if this is actually going to be good pizza, but the brand is a virtualized experience that we're presented with. So you assume it's just going to be good enough versus looking inside the window of a restaurant, walking down a street. Ironically, the only thing that looks remotely like a building you might understand is somewhere else. There, you have to go left. So this idea that the facade truly is, of course, the face of the building, and this means something, and particularly in a world that we built before we had zoning and codes and rules to make people build a certain way, that we happen to actually do it very well. And I think we often did it because we were gonna tattoo our name on our forehead when we were done. So there's a huge social responsibility that comes with that. This is a building on Broughton Street, our high street or Main Street in Savannah that is I love this building because it's a fine mixed-use retail building built in the 1920s by the Lamas family. It had survived the 20th century when everything was boarded up and, these buildings were at a very low ebb, and the Joyner family ran a furniture store there, and kept the building sort of from demolition all those years, and then young rule joiner, when he came into his majority, he said, "Well, listen, I'm gonna restore this building properly," and he was just so proud of the family heritage. He said, "I wanna put our family name on the forehead of the building." And, he was gonna put it up over that. And, of course, with our preservation protocols today, there was a lot of question about whether that was authentic or not, which I actually thought was incredibly authentic. If you're willing to put your name on the building, that's as good as it gets. Of course, the compromise was, well, you can have both names on the building. So Rule got his name, but he needed to do that. I think that's really important. In fact, for a photo shoot for a local magazine for his modern furniture store, Rule pulled some of his furniture right out into the middle of the street to have his photo taken, and I realized, they say that people start to look like their pets after a while and, or their dogs or cats, and, you know, I I can't see that building without seeing my friend Rule, because this building is very much part of his identity. And so these faces do tell a story. This is, maybe one successful banker that's, fallen on hard times delivering pizza, or a unfortunate split personality here. Gone to drinking and gambling, really. We've got parking and vodka. So, of course, it's hard to not talk about this without talking about the golden ratio and the way we apprehend beauty and how we're discovering more and more AI loves the golden ratio because it's mathematical. So we better pay attention to that as architects because I think we're going to be very surprised at how quickly reasonably good solutions can be presented to us using sort of these sacred ancient geometries. And of course, graphic designers know about this too. But we do deeply seek that. And when we see something that's misproportioned, we know something is terribly wrong. And again, we know this, but that's so important. So how are we applying this in architecture today? And these are slides I often share with audiences that maybe haven't thought about this so much as this group. But the the use of the golden ratio, I had a revelation about a year ago. I was visiting my friend Steve Cook, who's a really fantastic craftsman with wood and does amazing turnings. And he was doing a demonstration turning wood, and he said, "Well, we're going to put a kerf line in this baluster." And as he reached for a tool to do that, and it was a large wooden tool, it looked sort of like a compass. And I said, what do you do? What is that, Steve?" He's like, "Oh, that's my golden ratio tool." And I said, "Wait, excuse me?" I was like, "I've been in architecture for a while. I didn't realize there makes perfect sense. No one ever told me there was a simple tool that you could use to have the golden ratio anytime you wanted without having to use math." I thought, "That's really amazing." He's like, "Yeah, every time I use it, everything just comes out better." So it's like it was right by his side the whole time. So I immediately went back home and Googled golden ratio caliper, and tons of them came up. I was like, "What the heck is going on here?" I've never seen one, and who's using these? And they look just like this. You can buy one on online. Did anybody seen this? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the furniture maker. I love it. So, I have one, I keep one with me now. So it's a very simple tool, as you can see, and it just always has the ratio whenever you want it, so you don't have to think about it, you can just use it. And, pretty simple to use. This is a smaller one, his was much bigger. But it's how Steve, made decisions about the turnings he was doing, and there's many out there. This one looks a little menacing, actually, but it's a good thing, and I like talking about it because it's it's something that's available. So do you know who's using these? The ones that you can get online? The beauty industry. That's who's using them. That's why the corners aren't so sharp because they're actually used to shape eyebrows. So if you really want somebody to look good, you wanna use the golden ratio. So you wanna kinda take their eyebrow up, hit the peak, and then drop it. It's gonna look great. So you can get these, but they're perfect to have by your side when you're drawing because you can make good decisions without having to think too hard about it. So that was a discovery, and I'm excited. Of course, we have one at every desk in our office now. Of course, I like to talk about orientation. and the living body, the idea that when people are standing in environments that more or less match their shape at a bigger scale, it just makes you feel right. And buildings that sort of do that for us, remind us of our body in that upright living position. I love to pick on this particular building in Savannah, which is one of the most hated of our buildings, but it gives you that sort of that very dreadful feel when you approach it, and you can immediately picture yourself in another position. So I do like to talk about gravity, and I don't that's something that, doesn't need to be mentioned much here, but this particular quote from G.K. Chesterton really I think is beautiful. And it's a appeal to the cathedral, this idea that, if you could throw stones in the air and that they would hang and be suspended like a rainbow, it's which the principle of an arch. You can call it an affront to gravitation, but more correctly, an appeal to gravitation. That by combining separate stones of a particular shape in a particular way, we can ensure that their very tendency to fall prevents them from falling. It's a beautiful way to understand architects participating with gravity and doing sort of death-defying feats, and we don't really do that anymore. The covers of the magazines present buildings that, in fact, are designed to make you feel very uneasy as you see components that, of course, deep down aren't gonna fall off, but you just can't help but think something really terrible is happening here, or something that isn't even really possible is happening here. And I think this is malpractice, really. I think it's and the more we understand about neuroaesthetics and how our ancient brain processes fight or flight mechanisms, when we see things like this, all of our beauty receptors are actually shut down. You cannot apprehend beauty when you're making decisions about whether you need to run, because this is a dangerous situation. So any architect presenting danger as the final result of the design. I think this is truly malpractice, and then in fact, we're scientifically learning that it's shortening people's lives because it's causing chemical reactions in their body. So it's not about traditional design or maybe more formalist contemporary design, because certainly contemporary buildings can beautifully do this, can remind us of the role of gravity, but gosh, it's important. It's really I think it's the ultimate hubris in architecture that we've actually defied gravity. We've actually conquered it. We can do it. What is this, really? I mean, truly. I mean, it's like a joke with a bad punchline, and once you've heard it, it's just not funny at all. In fact, it's dangerous. So, an appeal to gravity is something I do like to talk about. Of course, the composition of a building, having a base in the middle and a top, meeting the sky, having a beautiful torso, having great shoes. Something we love to talk about. Buildings that sort of leave you wondering, what the parts and pieces are. This is truly a mechanistic proposition. Of course, this famous example in Prague reminded us that even architects like Frank Gehry could remind us of that human analogy. We we have to remember it. Of course, do walls have eyes? I like to talk about, the contraction of window as a wind eye is something I think is really quite beautiful. These are 2 buildings side by side in Savannah that, of course, we can measure the percentage of glazing in each. They're both four-story buildings. So you could say, well, their height and mass is very similar, but of course, their percentage of glazing, their eyes are very, very different, and you have to ask yourself, um, who would you rather sit next to at a party? So the wind eye, and it's just why this guard at the Vatican just looks right in that window. I think even color coding the window frame to his uniform probably helped. Of course, feet on the street, we talk about eyes on the street, the role of entrances, the frequency of entrances we like to talk about quite a bit. That is an absolutely human increment that we have to think at in the work that we do. Buildings that might have generally acceptable height and mass and vertical proportions and percentages of glazing and all those things we might describe as DNA, but have no entrances are certainly, hostile to the city. This is another Savannah example, but a building that really is gets a lot of things wrong, but it actually gets something really right. And since it was built 70 some odd years ago, it's always had businesses and it's always had an active ground floor. So it's performed very well at the street. So we count addresses. We've actually sort of made a science at counting addresses per block and then evaluating how the conversion, for example, of a two-way street to a one-way street changes the number of addresses over time. So it's a really interesting. It's sort of like an EKG meter of the health of a block, not just height, mass, square footage, bulk, volume, but actual porosity or the interactions that are happening at the street level. Can I visit somebody at what increment? So then, to the idea of then how are we actually making our buildings today? In this world made by hand, it's hard to not spend time in cities that were made by hand and not feel the resonance of those that came before you. I think it's hard to pretend that there's any other way, truly. Like, yes, we can mechanize, we can do things we couldn't have done maybe a few hundred years ago, but the act of the human hand and the making of places, I think it's irreducible, and it's the thing that we have to be the most fiercely protective of. This is watching a street outside of our office getting repaved, and I just marveled at, one brick at a time being laid to ultimately create a whole that long after they're gone, we all know this was a place made by people. And so the simple message is that I think we have to see our buildings not as sticks and bricks or our cities as, pipes and infrastructure, but really truly as people. That is the thing that will bring us back from the revolution, and it's really a series of revolutions. I feel like we've the Industrial Revolution, of course, irreversibly changed the way we would make things. The information age then changed. We conceived of a world around data, and now as we head into a virtual era where the cities that we make are seen as not even, in fact, real at all. So the makers movement, things that are sort of bringing us back to understanding the role of the hand. By the way, I want to thank the Brock, who ran the technology here, for giving me opportunity to draw on these slides tonight and actually get to use my hands. So these landmark books and texts and the research going on at the Academy for Neuroscience, I think these are all parts of how we're understanding it. What I'm excited about, though, is science is only helping us understand more and more that these things that we've always known were true are true. And it's really helpful to convince other people of those same ideas because we all seem to trust science. So we have to get there. I can't come to a school, where students are studying architecture without, and I feel like I hardly need to do this here, but the role of drawing, I think, is, you know, completely irreplaceable, and to not take any shortcuts. This is a 10,000-hour operation to really develop the skills in your hands that allow you to think through your hands, and I think I put Juhani Palazma's book up there, The Thinking Hand, which is a great text if you haven't seen it. I think this was an idea popularized by, Malcolm Gladwell, the idea that anything you do for 10,000 hours, you get very good at, whether it's playing a piano, whether it's drafting, and you think about it, if as a apprentice or an intern entering an office, if you're spending 40 hours a week, say, behind a drawing board, it's about 2,000 hours a year. So if you do that for 5 years, even if you're really kind of bad at drawing, you're gonna probably be very good at it after 5 years of doing it 40 hours a week. So I think there's not really a shortcut to it, but it's something that is so profoundly important to the work that we all do. My mentor is actually, was trained in Paris at the École in the 1920s when Georgia Tech had a relationship there. John LeBay, this was one of his drawings, and he was a master, and he could draw anything, and he would draw. We were talking about this earlier with the students. He would make the drawings first, and then if you liked the drawings, he would make a building about that drawing. Instead of designing your building and then making a drawing to pitch it to show what it might be like, he would go right to the finish line, say, "This is the experience," through, what you might think of as a travel sketch. This is actually in Florence, but in his own professional work, he would go right to the end and draw the experience of the thing that he might make, and if it was a good thing, then he would make architecture was more of a backup to the experiences that he could reveal through his drawings, and I've tried to take that to heart. This is me a long time ago learning how to draw. And, I actually spent a lot of time growing up in Florence, Italy, so this is my other hometown, but a place, place of great beauty that affirms these universal ideas about placemaking over time. So, draw. Please. And I've had the good fortune of teaching abroad on a number of occasions, and it's amazing to watch the evolution of students that, start a trip like this not drawing very well, and then by the 3rd or 4th week, they're starting to create amazing drawings with ballpoint pens in their sketchbooks. So it's well known that the use of our hands to interpret what we're seeing is always going to yield lasting learning. And this is not even a theory. Whether you take notes by hand or you take them on a laptop, the notes you take by hand are always going to help you pass the test, even if they're not as accurate because you've actually committed them to memory. So that's my appeal, I guess, to remembering to draw in all that you do. Particularly important today as we're presented with more and more tools that make it easier to, let's say, well, can I just run a filter on this drawing, this SketchUp model to have a watercolor feel? It's like, what a waste of time because you're missing the opportunity to actually have learned from doing the thing. So I would say as all the tools expand, we have to take the tools that are ultimately humane and turn up the volume on those activities. So from principle to practice, this was the next part of what I was gonna talk about, and a couple of projects. There's actually one that I'd like to focus on because it gets more to the making of a building, the 3rd one, but I put a few slides together of some projects we've worked on over the last few years. This one is one in Savannah called Plant Riverside District, which actually it received the Urban Land Institute's Global Award. Actually received the Congress for New Urbanism's Grand Prize Award just a few years ago. It was a great project. It was a part of a redevelopment of a 4.5 acre site on the river, but it was one where we were able to put public space first. So taking this legendary grid of the Savannah plan and then revisiting this sort of forgotten corner that had been used as a electrical power plant for about a century. And it began with connecting the city back to the river and then completing the pedestrian network on the river and on River Street. So a pretty simple plan. That was the master plan for the project. And this was very much in the mode of urbanism, urban design at a sort of a block scale, you might say, a few blocks, and then, thinking about how the architecture would animate it. And it was a mix of historic preservation. This was actually the 1916 power plant. These were additions that were done in the 1930s and 40s, and then a series of new buildings to the east and a large new building to the west, and then smaller structures on the waterfront. So this was a wonderful project. We worked on it with a team of architects, but we served as design architect for really all of this project, the public realm and the exterior and core interior spaces of the building. So great adaptive reuse opportunity there, which we had known would come. Its day would come. It actually remained operational as a power plant until 2007, remarkably. And, so if you come to Savannah, you have to let me know, and I'd be happy to visit with you and walk you about the Plant Riverside district. Great example of early industrial architecture that makes you stand up a bit straighter too. There was a lot of theory about early power plants because it was a building type that had no precedent. So there were two young architects named Stone and Webster, MIT grads, edited a journal on how to design power plants, and they said, "You've got to make these buildings look so good and so believable that people will believe the thing being made inside of them is real, because you can't see it." This was the first form of power that was totally invisible. You always, whether it was coal or gas or wood, oil, it was always a thing that made power, and electricity was voodoo. So the buildings that they were advocating in this early industrial era were deliberately civic in their character. And I think it's amazing that such a building that has such nobility more than 100 years later is eagerly adapted to a new use. The central atrium or the old generator hall, the turbine hall, is a natural science exhibition. So this was a really great project, but I'm most excited about the fact that it was a very public realm driven project. So we could talk about that. Of course, in housing, and just seeing in the studios today, some of the work going on was very encouraging, and there's so much being done, certainly with Dean Polyzoids here, does not need to be said, but there's so much work to be done in this space right now. We see it as an acute problem in so many of our older cities and certainly newer cities as well. We had an opportunity some years ago now in Charleston to work on a large infill site, large-ish, you might say, in a block on Bay Street there. And you can see the fabric of smaller buildings around. It was kind of a dilemma because you had the institutional investment model, the multifamily box that they wanted to put on the lot because that's how big it was, and it wasn't gonna work. So we had the opportunity to really talk typologically about the buildings of the city, whether they were the larger civic buildings like the old Union Station or perhaps the Bennett Rice Mill or the cigar factory or the old Murray School, and also the smaller buildings. And the answer to the problem was to create a building that was a big building, but big enough for Charleston, which was sort of this pavilion, 3 pavilions on the street, and then using smaller Charleston singles that were actually 3-unit, essentially 3-unit apartments or condominiums in a smaller footprint format around the edges. So we had sort of a civic presence to the main building and then developed a character and a language that was sympathetic to Charleston. You know, this one up at the street, brick a little tougher, and then wood toward the back row there. So it just sort of fits into the neighborhood. So this was an alternative to the typical, and I can tell you this was you know, an investor and a developer that was very familiar with the typical format. You know, fortunately, a city like Charleston holds dearly the quality of their fabric, so it created the opportunity to rethink the model, which essentially get very close to the density you might have gotten had you put a box on the site, but created a much higher value environment, which actually immediately I think what they learned was the rental prices for these smaller single homes was actually the highest on the peninsula as soon as they finished them. Of course, that was an unintended consequence, but it was a reminder of the scarcity of that kind of work. So this was a pretty quiet project, but I'm proud of it because it's part of sort of building that toolkit, that vocabulary of bringing back true, you know, traditions of a place and then using that to solve pressing issues of housing today. So I guess finally, and this is the part I've been excited to share this with you, and I think I've become more personally excited about the idea of the making of architecture. And we spent a lot of time right talking about codes and you know just understanding sort of the DNA side of it, but the actual heart of the matter, I think, is remembering that we have to make our buildings as humans, and this is something we can't do as architects. We can't do it alone. So building a culture, rebuilding a culture of artisans and craftsmen that are truly part of that process, I think is the only way. You can't fake it. When you see something that's been made by a human hand, you absolutely know that it has been, and there's no simulation to that that's possible. We're very fortunate in Charleston. The American College of Building Arts was founded by former Mayor Joe Riley to do just that, to create a culture of building well in Charleston. I think at the time it was created, it was after, Hurricane Hugo, which was a dramatic landmark in the history of the city, and I think it was created with the idea that we'll need these craftsmen to keep Charleston alive, you know, long into the future, so we will know how to repair the assets that we already have. I think today we have to pivot that toward building new and using the skills and the traditions that are being developed in a context like this. So we've been very, very fortunate to get to work with the ACBA to start to bring them into some of the work that we've been doing, particularly in Charleston. So the idea of the human hand, like you can't see the old Farmers and Exchange Bank and think there's ever a version of Charleston that can be too fancy or too exotic. It's like really, if you're not living up to that invitation in that city, then what are you doing? So we had an opportunity to work on a larger building on King Street that kind of brought us back to that dilemma of how we build today at an institutional scale, but how could we create fabric that would be sort of emotion? And it actually kind of brought us back to the Vienna Secession with this sort of the struggle of the industrial age and the loss that was evident to the architects at that time, and I felt like we could make that analogy today and the sort of the systemization of our field, the pervasive use of Revit, the pervasive use of sort of automated product placement that our industry has sort of become addicted to. So what if you could what if you could reunite painting and sculpture and architecture again, very much the way the secessionists did? And you would need all 3. This is actually the entry to the building, and we have these panels, one representing painting, one representing sculpture, and then architecture in the keystone. So, sort of a reminder of these basic truths about placemaking, and an architecture that would be sort of intentionally humane and, these softening forms, these laurel arches, that became kind of a theme for this particular design. So, this is part of the design methodology, how to take a large building, but start to create details at the increment of, a single gate or, perhaps, a carved stone inset or a carefully crafted column capital. And I think we were inspired by the ACBA when we saw what they were capable of doing. We were imagining, columns holding up bay windows. And as we walked through the studios, they said, "Oh, this is just freshman work." I said, "This freshman work is better than anything being done today." So we, in a sense, sort of designed a building that was an invitation for craft as a case study. This building is not far from where their program is located, and so it in a sense, it's a case study. And it's a case study to kind of call people back to feeling things perhaps that maybe they haven't felt in a long time. The general public, not architects per se, and sort of an appeal to emotion. And it's brought us in very, very close collaboration with artists and craftsmen. There's a very fine artist, Carl Fugers, who actually lives in Vienna now, but has collaborated with us before on a number of projects. And he took some of these early ideas and started to develop them, the representation of architecture on the central keystone, or these flanking panels of painting and sculpture, creating the invitation for the craftsman that could then take it beyond that. We have 4 keystones that line along the main street face, representing the 4 seasons, but each a season of architecture. So you have, Art Nouveau in the spring, and you have sort of a full-blooded classicism in the summer, and a Baroque fall, and then a chilly Gothic winter there. So these were all very, in a way, very simple themes. We felt like this was a building that was part of the way back to things you could talk about with somebody on the street. They're like, "Well, that's very interesting. I understand that." Sort of, and connecting the idea of art and nature and, nothing too controversial here. So, and then we also realize there's numerous opportunities, particularly for a big building, for individual hand-carved ornaments. So we began to create general models with Carl as a collaborating artist and some of the architects in our practice. What's been very exciting, and I'm gonna show you some things that I've not ever put on screen before tonight. I put them together because I thought they might be of interest to the group tonight. But we started to take those panels, the columns, the keystones, and so on, start to really develop them into looking at the capabilities of what was there in the studio. These were parts of the inspiration that we realized that this work could be done. Convincing institutionally minded developers that this could be done is also is a leap of faith. But what's interesting is the art and the humanity of this making draws everybody into the story. And we've really marveled over this process, watching these, hardened developers sort of melt when they see young students chipping away at stone in the studios. This is, by the way, some of you may know Joseph Kincannon, who is a master stonemason, one of the lead faculty at the ACBA. So it's been a gift, and the opportunity here is to bring true craft back to the public realm in a very kind of visceral way. So we've had a lot of fun with this, and over the last few months now, we've actually began the process of, making before we started making, we said we better test things to make sure they really look right at scale. So that's the keystone around that main entry. And we said, "We better know what that looks like when you hold it up 20 feet above the street." So we found that the simplest building we could use to run a demonstration of that, that's Craig Clements in our office holding up the full-scale model or the keystones that are up above that. up in the air. We actually got kicked out. They thought we were staging a demonstration. They saw us on top of the building. Yeah. So, yeah, it was a demonstration against, ugliness. So the stone carving is beginning, and this is what I'm gonna flip through these images is, you're starting to see the work being done. What I love is this is not being done by a machine, and it's not being done by, a well-seasoned craftsman, but it's being done by a whole atelier of young minds. These are the people that will live in this building, and the enthusiasm that they have brought. They spent the summer in the studio. They said, "Well, let's just knock out these rosettes," and that's Albert cutting into one, and we in sort of in the Gothic or maybe the Christian mode, we wanted the detail to be an invitation for the artist to take it further. So we have, many standard sizes, but no standard way in which to carve it so that they could then leave their own fingerprints. This is Tatum. Actually, Professor Hartley shared this photo with me. He had run into her on the National Mall at the Smithsonian event this summer, and she had actually taken some of the stones from Charleston to work on while she was up there. So so this is one component of the building, fairly simple, integrated, coursed into the brickwork. Also wanted this artwork to be unremovable from the building, because a lot of times, people look at the students making these beautiful things like, "Oh, isn't that sweet? Why don't we, like, add something to the building that wasn't there before?" It's like, we want this to be 100% integral to the building. You can't take it off. You'll have a hole in the building. So these rosettes are sort of deceivingly simple, but they're actually fully integral into the fabric of the facades, and so it leaves human fingerprints all over the building. And they've carved quite a few. I think there's something like 68 altogether of different sizes, and they're all beautiful, and they're all very different. So this has been a joy. This was sort of a point of entry to the process, and there's a great sense of accomplishment, and that makes me extremely happy to see another generation sort of bringing their spirit to the public realm. Of course, the keystones were a way to be very, directly humanistic in our carving. Actually, this is Iris, who's really a unbelievable. She's a graduate now, but she was finishing up, and now she's sort of stayed on to help with this project, starting to kind of prove that these drawings could be brought to life, and has done a really fine job with these keystones. That's our spring, our Gothic winter, which everyone loves the veil, and then she says, "That's the easiest one to do." But they're really quite remarkable. So the building is sort of shaping up. The details are shaping up. The central keystone, which is a major feature for it, that's Joseph Kincannon as the stone is unloaded from Alabama, and they've sketched onto the face and started to sort of bring the design to life with this large scale piece of limestone. Yeah. So taking shape. She's actually gonna be holding a bronze compass, so making sure the analogy comes across that she's representing architecture. Maybe it should be a golden ratio caliper. So, the stone columns, there are a series of these. They're rounding them out of square stock and, carving them down. I don't think any of the OSHA requirements are being met here. Somebody pointed that out to me, but that's, yeah, Albert again. Again, the columns all have regularity in their shape and their size and their locations, but all have the impulse and the inspiration of the designer as well. So beautiful work taking shape there, and a great sense of pride in that work. So we're very excited. These are three of the half shafts of those columns that'll line some of the alleyways around the building. Also, we couldn't carve everything by stone, and so making plaster models that we could then render in, reconstructed stone or cast stone was part of the flight plan for the project, and of course, we had ultimately, we did produce some of the drawings in CAD to make sure that the Revit model would ultimately behave well with these things in it. So the caster said, "Well, can't we just produce, we'll just 3D print the thing right out of CAD." I'm like, "No, we really want it to be made by a human being." I think, well, like, the profiles are pretty simple. So we said, "Okay, well, then we're gonna make make them more complex." This is actually, so in the plaster modeling, this is Rowan. She's helping us kind of work on these acanthus garlands, and she's extremely proud of this beautiful drawing she's made. and figured out how to get the pattern repeat to work. So when we get the model, it's going to be able to work out across the frieze, or some of the details that they've modeled for us for approval. What's amazing is this is being done by students, students led by really great faculty, and so I think it resonates for me so much to see the talented faculty here in the architecture program and this whole generation of architects that will bring us back closer to a beautiful world. So this has been a joy, a personal journey and a joy, and it's involved so many people, and there's just so much excitement around it that I wanted to share it with you. Figuring out how to do things for the first time in a way, it feels that way. You know, how to build that garland. So these are the plaster models, the clay ultimately plaster models, starting to set up the patterns that will adorn the the base model, the mother mold, you might say, for the bases of the columns. This is Steve Kester, who's their lead plaster faculty member there, and he's been a champ as well, organizing students to develop even cornices so that they would not be just because you could extrude them from a computer, that they're not extruded from a computer. They have the imperfection of the human hand in them. So so this process has been going from drawings that were produced for the set to ultimately starting to build the bases, build the framework. We reached a point, we said, "We've got to make sure people know that this was made by hand." So we said, "Well, what if could we broach the surface on the column?" And I go, "Why would we do that?" It's like, "Well, we want evidence." So we spent a lot of time talking about how to create a pattern of grooving on those vertical surfaces, and Steve made a special template so he could then have students run their hands over the vertical surfaces in the models so that you would have something that we could not have printed out of a computer. It would have that imperfection, right in the mold. And so that the attention to little things like that has been part of the journey, part of the learning as these pilaster bases and capitals have been getting built up to really quite elaborate effect, and some simpler ones too. Casting, of course, the egg and dart, casting these rosettes into it, and kind of working through each of those elements. So that's the mother mold for one of the more ornate capitals that become part of the building, and you can sort of see the evidence of the hand all over it. So really excited about that, and so is Rowan. And other things too, invitations for detail, headers over doors, which certainly aren't necessary, but are another way to sort of enrich the pedestrian experience, sort of a gift of the street, and students starting to develop those models as well in clay. Looking at precedent, going as far as they could go from the drawings that we were able to create and then taking it further. That's at full scale. And it's Iris again. There's blacksmithing as well as one of the trades that they teach at ACBA, and so, that was certainly not to be left out. So we have a number of details for the building, whether decorative lanterns that are sort of extravagant or elements that are a bit simpler, but also have the unique design of the artisans making them. So I think we have 16 gates that are all individually crafted and hand riveted together, and really quite remarkable work. Their lead blacksmith is a fellow named Matt Garton, who is tremendous talent, and he's got a whole generation of blacksmiths that he's trained. So so there we are. I think the world is ready. It's so interesting that the humanistic carvings on this building immediately caught people's attention. Iris was on the cover of local paper as she started carving one of those keystones, and Veranda magazine not long ago just featured an article on the college building arts. But they sort of come back to the human form being present in the building. I think it's the most powerful way for us to just sort of close the gap between all the theory and the actual practice of making. So that's what I prepared. I know there's a lot of slides. Thank you for letting me share those with you. I've not shown any of those photos before, of the work going on at the ACBA, but I was really excited to get a chance to showcase some of that with you all tonight. So thank you very much.